Thank you for tuning in to today's webcast with Ipsos. My name is Zina Pagan, ARF's Marketing Manager, and I will be your moderator for today. Before we begin learning about the 2016 U.S. election, I will go over a few housekeeping items. The audio will be streamed. This means that you will be able to hear us through your computer speakers. However, if you prefer to use a teleconference option, I will post the information on the chat box. Should you have any questions during the session, please send those to me using the chat box. We will only have time to take one question during the Q&A. Should there be any more questions, please send those to me and I will forward these along to our presenters for further discussions offline. This session will be recorded. If you would like to view the recorded event, it will be available on demand within 2 weeks from today. For the best webcast experience, please keep yourself muted and your camera turned off. We are extending the conversation on social media, so if you would like to join us, please use the hashtag ARFWebcast. If you are interested in hosting a webcast of your own, please email me at zina@thearf.org. The ARF does have a few events coming up. Tomorrow, Thursday, June 2nd, ARF will feature the one-day spring session of the Leadership Lab, and it will focus on neuroscience. And if you're planning to attend audience measurement, this is just a reminder, the event is coming up June 12th to the 14th. We did add an additional day. This year we have Sarah Hofstetter from 360i and Kathleen Hall from Microsoft as our keynotes. If you're interested in any one of these events or other ARF programs, please let me know and I will be happy to direct you to the correct parties. And without further delay, I present to you Jim Meyers, Chief Marketing Officer of Ipsos North America. Jim, take it away.
Thanks very much, Zina, and welcome everyone to Ipsos Inside Track. First, our thanks to the ARF for hosting us, and in fact for having us back. We were very proud to help relaunch ARF Wednesday webcasts back in March with one of the earlier installments of this series. This session is part of a monthly series on the presidential elections in the United States. Ipsos has been running this series since February and will run through the election in November. As many of you know, Ipsos is a global leader in political and social polling. The purpose of this session, as all these sessions, is to help you understand the key dynamics going on at the time, immediately, that are making this presidential election tick, this frankly crazy presidential election tick. We try to bring all of our experience and frankly the knowledge that we have from having followed over 500 elections worldwide in the past number of years to help put real perspective on what's going on in the U.S. presidential election now. We also aim to help you understand the science of election prediction, which, as you can imagine, is very close to our heart at Ipsos. If you enjoyed this session, and I hope you do, you can go to ipsos-na.com, go to our Knowledge Center, where you'll find links to register for upcoming sessions and an ability to listen to archived recordings of previous sessions. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Julia Clark, who's a Senior Vice President, and Chris Jackson, Vice President, both of Ipsos Public Affairs. Both of these two are experienced pollsters, and I hope you enjoy the session. Julia, Chris, take it away.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Welcome to the fifth installment of these Inside Track updates on the election 2016. For those of you who have joined us before, forgive me as I do a very brief plug for some of the Twitter accounts where you can find Ipsos' data, our polls, and our analyses. These are some of our Ipsos properties, as well as the individual Twitter accounts for myself, Chris, and Cliff Young, the president of Ipsos Public Affairs, as well as the Twitter accounts for our client Reuters. And all of these accounts work to promote polls as they're newly released, so are a great place to find poll data as it is breaking and new. And as you can see here, there's some of the hashtags that we also use when we are tweeting both this session as well as about the election more broadly. Today's talk is going to go over a few themes that we've touched on before, but we're going to explain a little bit more about the importance of their context now. Some of the broader trends that are shaping what's going on in politics now and that are yielding some of the leaders that we're seeing from the two parties, an update on the state of the primaries and the election, and then I'm going to take over and talk a little bit about Donald Trump himself and where his support is coming from a little bit in more depth, as well as some light touch projections or odds making in terms of some of the November outcomes. So I'll pass over to Chris Jackson to talk about trends and the state of the election.
Hi, everyone. It's great to join you again for our fifth installment of the election. Look forward to a lot more as the season continues. Starting off with some of the big trends, we've talked a couple of times about how elections really should not be seen in isolation. They're always sort of a call and response with what's happening out in the rest of the country, out in the rest of the world even. And we wanted to really focus on a couple of those trends that are driving some of the dynamics we're seeing this year. First off, this is the slide you see now is looking at general social survey data from the 70s to currently, and it's showing how social issues are declining in some of the impact that they have in driving debate because people are generally speaking becoming a little bit more liberal, a little bit more progressive. We have the number of people who believe homosexual relationships are not wrong at all. And this number has gone from the low teens in the 70s and early 80s to 60% of Democrats, 37% for Republicans. So you can see even among Republicans there's this sort of liberal shift on this issue and a number of other social issues. And there's also been sort of an increasing separation between the two parties. But because of this liberal movement, the social conservatives that used to dominate the Republican Party aren't quite as monolithic as they used to be, and it's why there's been this opening for this sort of new schism of sort of populism and nativism that Trump has taken advantage of. At the same time, there has been recently a decline in the faith in government. The number of Americans who believe government should do more to help people has declined over the last couple of years. And here, too, there's a pretty big schism between Democrats and Republicans, what they believe on this issue. So to sort of restate, we have social issues. Country, generally speaking, is becoming more liberal. Government issues, people are becoming less trusting in the government. And then there's other factors like immigration. Immigration is something that's actually happening. There are more immigrants coming into the country than there have been in other phases of time. This is the percent of the population that's foreign-born, and you can see it's somewhere between 12 and 13% now versus in the single digits back in the era from the 20s to the 80s. And that sort of echoes some earlier time periods where we saw a large sort of nativist epics in sort of the public debate, the Know-Nothing era in the mid-1800s and the anti-Catholic era around the turn of the last century. And this, too, feeds into sort of this, making this sort of ferment of an environment that candidates like Trump has been successful in. And then finally, there is the economic pressure on the middle class. This is disposable personal income from the late 60s through the late 2000s, and you can see that disposable personal income, this is essentially the amount of cash you have in your pocket, the ability to sort of buy things that aren't necessarily need to have, has declined over the last 40 years, and this sort of represents the declining fortunes of the middle class. And that's why 63% of people in some of our latest polling say that they're worse off than their parents. So you have this environment where people are feeling economically stressed. They're seeing a lot of people born in other countries here in the United States. The social issues aren't quite as cohesive as they used to be to sort of be something to rally behind, and they don't necessarily trust government. And who is actually talking about all of those issues? Candidates like Donald Trump. So that takes us into the election. A brief sort of stopover in the primary because it's not technically done yet. There's 7 states left to vote, including the District of Columbia. Most of these states are going to be voting on June 7th. D.C. votes on June 14th. And these couple of states really are only going to affect the Democratic primary because as of today, Donald Trump has passed the 51% mark to wrap up the Republican nomination based on some uncommitted delegates who have come around to support him. But on the Democratic side, we see we see the race is still continuing, and Clinton has won about 54% of the pledged delegates to date. So that's of the delegates you essentially win by winning elections, not including the superdelegates. And if you include superdelegates, she's at 2,287. This number is actually a little bit higher now because there's a couple of more that were pledged since I put this together. And unless something particularly catastrophic happens on June 7th when California, New Jersey, and a couple of other states hold their elections, she's going to get over that mark. She's going to get to that 2,383 delegates she needs to get the majority. So barring any sort of really catastrophic events, she's going to be the Democratic nominee. Now that sort of puts us in the frame of the general election. So it's going to be Trump and Clinton. And in the last couple of weeks, we've seen polling close between the two of them. We actually had them tied at one point about 2 weeks ago, and now there's about a 4 or 5 point margin between them in our tracking poll. And what's going on there? Because we saw a much larger margin back in mid-March, mid-April between them. Well, what's happening is Trump's favorability, the sentiment people have towards Trump, has been rebounding in the last few weeks, where Clinton's has been flatlined. This slide shows Hillary Clinton's total favorability score, 47%, and Donald Trump's total favorability score, 44%. And you can see Trump had a dip in March and April when the Republican primary got particularly nasty, and he's recovering now sort of ever so slowly. And what's driving this? There's been a lot of conversation about how this is symbolic of losing support for the general election, or is this because of inter-party fights? Well, our analysis indicates that this is really an inter-party fight thing. This is Hillary Clinton's favorability scores by various ideological groups. So among the very liberal, the moderately liberal, the people who lean liberal, lean conservative, moderately conservative, very conservative, what is their favorability towards Hillary Clinton? And you can see among the liberal, she's lost ground since the beginning of the year. She's gone from 80% to 72% among the very and moderate liberal, from 69 to 64 among the people who lean liberal. But among the conservatives, she's actually not lost much ground. A little bit of ground with lean conservative, but almost no change with moderate and very conservatives. This is indicative of the primary essentially damaging Hillary Clinton's standing with liberal voters, particularly considering that it's the very and moderate liberals. This is with Sanders voters. Her position has been damaged. And the question is going to be is once the nomination is concluded, and if Sanders gets behind Clinton and endorses her, will she be able to sort of recover this support like Donald Trump has? So you see Donald Trump saw the same phenomenon where conservative voters disliked him, liked him less in March and April. You see this sort of dip in the trends here. But then since he's wrapped it up, they've rallied around him, and his numbers have rebounded to basically what they were at the start of the year. So the real question as we move forward in looking for towards the general election is, will Clinton be able to wrap up the nomination and secure support of the Democratic Party to go into a head-to-head fight with Donald Trump?
Which takes us back to me here. So what I'm going to do now is not only talk a little bit about Donald Trump as a nice seg from Chris's points there, but take a step back first and look at some of the models and the structures that we as pollsters use when we try to predict an election. And this is becoming relevant now. We've touched on some of these ideas before in previous webinars, but not to the level of detail I'm about to, because we now have candidates. Our assumption is that Clinton will secure the Democratic nomination, and obviously Trump has already secured the Republican one, if not formally, then certainly practically speaking. So as a pollster, Chris and I and our team here, we face a series of conundrums because we use models as a huge part of our analytics and the way we make predictions when we do polling. We obviously look at our own poll numbers, but we do a lot more than just that. And one of the core models that we use that I've discussed previously is what we called our fundamentals model or our base rate model. It's a very structural model for elections, and it's based on historical data, not just in the U.S. but globally. It's based on about 600 elections worldwide, and it takes two variables, incumbency and the current rating of the sitting government. And it makes a prediction about the likelihood of the government party remaining in power. It's a simple model in many ways in that it only has two variables, and it actually has a very high predictive value of about 85%. What that does mean is that about 15% of elections don't fall into the parameters of this model and aren't really predicted by it, and there's increasing evidence that this one may be one of them. But that said, it's one of our strongest predictive tools, and it's obviously something we've been focused on since the outset. We actually wrote an op-ed back in October all about this model, predicting 2016 was at least had the fundamentals to be a Republican year, and nothing about that has changed even till now, and I can explain why. But very simply, at Obama's current approval rating, which is right around 50% at the moment, it may have dropped a little bit, and the fact that there's no incumbent on the ticket means we have a successor scenario. Clinton is a successor to the sitting president rather than the incumbent, of course, the president herself, which means that her likelihood of a win is low. It's about, it's here 28%. It's probably even a little bit lower than that. Let's call it 25%. Which obviously is a situation that is an advantage to Republicans, right? This is why we've been calling 2016 for a long time a Republican year, because our base fundamental model, and it's not just ours, there's some other great models out there, some of which incorporate economic elements or other types of approval or satisfaction ratings that all use similar base inputs that do suggest that this is a year favorable to a Republican outcome. Now, that seems simple, except for the fact that the other big models that we look at are poll-based, of course, right? Much more recent data. We look at our own polls. We also, like many of our other pundits and our colleagues and our competitors, we aggregate polls. We look at all the polls as a collective as well. And poll-based modeling suggests very strongly that this is a Clinton year, right? That Clinton has the advantage because she's been massively ahead in the polls until pretty recently and still maintains a very clear lead on average in the polls, right? We've seen a few that put Trump ahead, but if we look at things across the average, Clinton still has a very clear lead. And so we have these two completely divergent outcomes, right? We have a fundamentals model which tells us it's almost certainly a Republican year, and we have a poll model which tells us it's almost certainly going to be a Democratic win. And how we reconcile these is the challenge that we're grappling with right now. And it's not so simple. We're trying out a lot of different things. We should pair this with the fact that we should pair this one about the poll modeling with the fact that we know that polls this far out from the election are less reliable, right? Maybe 5 or 6 points out from the outcome. Now, in an election where one party is clearly ahead, which is what the polling indicates now, this sort of thing is not such a problem. But in a very closely fought election, a difference of a point or two can, of course, make the difference between a winner and a loser. So, yes, the poll-based models predict very strongly that Clinton will take things. We know, however, that also that polls this far out, their predictive value is diminished a little bit. So these are all different factors we're trying to balance in our minds, and of course looking at our day-to-day numbers as well to look for movement. So what is a pollster to do? What we do as a first step is we look at some alternative scenarios. And these are things we just build ourselves based on our own data that allow us to dig in a little bit more deeply and understand a bit more about what's going on. So we create these hypotheticals, right? We don't have at the moment approval ratings on Donald Trump because, of course, he hasn't been in political leadership. But we do have favorability ratings, and we have had them for a long time now. And as Chris just alluded to, of course, we've seen that they've declined and that they've started to recover a bit in recent weeks. So what we can do is we can use those favorability ratings and model them essentially to see what things would look like if his his favorability ratings were to go up or down, and how that may correlate with different election outcomes. So this is a a chart which we need to read from the bottom up, right? So we start with the favorability rating right there at the bottom. We have three different scenarios. One where Trump's favorability is far lower than it is now at just 23%. One which is about the current scenario, which is at about 43%. It's maybe a little lower right now. And one where we see significant improvement in his favorability ratings. And then as we move our eyes up from there, you can see the relative odds for Trump associated with each of those ratings, as well as we've modeled out what we think the vote share will be based on the numbers that we have to hand. So as you can see where things are now, Clinton still certainly holds the advantage. It's a smaller advantage than probably, the poll data suggests, right, which seems to put her sort of wildly at an advantage of odds of sort of 70, 80, 90% of winning. But it certainly still gives her the edge, right, where you can see that vote share outcome at 42 for Clinton and 38 for Trump. Obviously things worsen should his favorable ratings go down. But what's interesting, of course, is that as they climb, we do see a sort of a turning point at which Trump would, in this model at least, pull to even odds and even a vote share outcome favorable towards him. So we're working to figure out where exactly we think that cusp is. It's looking to us at the moment like it's a high 50s, sort of a mark that would push him into territory where he was on about even keel with Clinton in terms of his odds of a win. And so that is a key factor that we're going to be looking at for tracking purposes in the coming weeks and months as we are tracking this election, is where is Trump's favorability? And is it continuing to climb, or has it really crystallized in these low 40s? Because if it has, that does not bode well for him in terms of his ability to push forward, garner more supporters, and take the election. But if it does begin to recover a little bit more strongly, perhaps his current low favorability is simply an artifact of a very contentious, acidic, angry primary process, which has really depressed his favorability, rather than this idea that, he's just fundamentally seen as unfavorable by people because of some of his positioning. And we don't know which of those is the case yet. Obviously, he's begun some recovery, but we haven't, seen the full coalescing of the Republican Party around him as the candidate yet, although it's definitely moving in that direction. And so it's possible we'll see continued or further recovery. And if we do not, that will be an important early signal about his viability in terms of election this November. So how we combine these, and this is a little bit of a dense slide for which I apologize, but it's something we use internally here as we're calculating some of our probabilities, is we essentially take a lot of different model-based outcomes, and for lack of a better way of doing things, we just average them. And we come up with an average. And here, as you can see, it's not too dissimilar to what I was just talking about, just over 50-50 odds for Clinton at this point in time. And this includes a range of scenarios that are more and less optimistic in terms of favorability ratings for both Clinton and for Trump, as well as our fundamentals base rate model and some others. So at this point in time, feet to the fire, our odds would put Hillary with just a small advantage, just over 50%, and with Trump obviously just below 50% odds. What's interesting though is that, and maybe some of you are sort of saying this right now to yourself, this puts us at odds with much of the market, and by the market I mean sort of the other pollsters and pundits and forecasters out there doing analytics like ours, of course, ours being the more wonderful ones, but no, doing analytics and looking at polls. Ours is, in terms of the perspective of Clinton, at least far more conservative, whereas the market looks to be relying more on the poll-based modeling that I described rather than some of those fundamentals models, and therefore putting her odds far higher than we are. Now, we both still have the odds with Clinton rather than with Trump at this point in time, although we've done some modeling which does suggest that could shift, as you saw with the favorability data. So I think, we are a little bit outside what the rest of the market is saying. We also have an outstanding record for accuracy, so Just remember, you heard it here first. But I think what we'll be watching very closely in the coming weeks and months as we're tracking this is that favorability rating as one of our key indicators. That's all I have for today. We've got a few minutes left, though, and we wanted to make sure we left some time for questions. So it is really over to you at this point in time to field any questions you may have. Thank you. Oh, and we have one question already I see here. The vote share on the polling scenario chart comes to about 80%. Do you expect the other 20% to go to a third candidate or, and I'm just opening this up so I can see it in full.
Write-in candidate, where did that other 20% go? The 20% is a combination of third party, wouldn't vote, and don't know, roughly in equal proportions. Right now we're reporting registered voters, so there's actually still a lot of people who aren't going to show up on election day included in those polls, and a good chunk of those are those people in that don't know bucket. We still sort of include them in the data and the surveys, though I didn't include them in the graph just to make the graph cleaner. But as we start reporting likely voters, a lot of those people are going to get dropped out because they're unlikely to show up on election day.
Thanks, Chris. Any other questions? Oh, and I wanted to mention one that we had this morning, which I think somebody asked us to cover today as well, which was about Sanders himself and his likelihood of running as an independent candidate. We've actually had quite a few sort of independent requests from just general members of the public who follow our polls to look into this. We aren't at the moment. It's definitely something we're considering, but by our last estimate, Sanders has stated pretty clearly that he is interested in the Democratic ticket and not in running as an independent, and his wife has made a specific statement to that effect. So at this point in time, we are not running polling between Clinton, Trump, and Sanders as an independent candidate, simply because it seems a very unlikely scenario. Although it's certainly something that we discuss with our clients and would happily consider. The other thing to point out there is that from an almost operational perspective, it's very, very difficult for candidates to actually gain ballot access as independents in all 50 states. If an independent candidate were to emerge in the coming weeks or months even, I think they would have a great deal of difficulty from a legal perspective in securing ballot access in all 50 states. So I don't know if anybody was thinking about that question, but it was asked previously, and I wanted to make sure I covered it here. Any other questions that we can answer at this point in time? Wonderful. Well, listen, thank you all so much for joining. We're right on the half-hour mark, so we are trying to keep to a timely schedule here. We really encourage you to join us next month on, I believe, June 23rd at the next of these seminars. You can sign up now on our website. And thank you again for joining.